Creating a viable Outram statement. Drafting an Outram paper can be a rewarding experience as we A. research the sources of our own beliefs and others' opposing beliefs, and B. articulate the true stakes that we and they have in holding those beliefs without resorting to caricature and distortion. The process of following the argument all the way through to a reasoned and reasonable conclusion does not have to be arduous. The most difficult part of writing an Outram paper of any length is creating a viable Outram statement, which is step 1 in the process. This refers to both the initial Outram paper that you will write of 3 to 5 pages, as well as to the extended Outram paper of 12 to 15 pages. The initial Outram statement, your initial viable Outram statement, is also the shortest segment of the paper and is only a sentence long, prefaced by the words, "whether it is the case that." For this reason, I request that you make the sentence that follows that phrase a positive statement of something you believe and that is related to the topic you are considering, and that is itself related to one of the 4 major issues of the course. An example of a positive statement of belief is the scriptural and experiential notion, God is love. If I were to submit this claim to interrogation by the Outram process, I believe it is viable because it is one, simple, meaning uncomplicated, straightforward, and it is not a compound statement where it is unclear what I am being compelled to defend. And 2, it is debatable, given the conflicting images of God in Scripture and differences in the way God, if God exists, is experienced in the lives of individuals, communities, and nations. We can apply this Outram to a consideration of any of our 4 guiding issues, whether gender and sexuality, racism, the environment, or the Palestinian-Israeli conflagration. Another reason I request that you frame the initial Outram statement positively is because it is harder, if not impossible, to prove a negative, and still harder to come to an appreciation of others' stakes in holding contrary positions to your own, or to a resolution that honors their humanity. And still a third reason that I request that you frame the initial Outram statement positively is because it is much more productive of the ends that we want to be defined by. I have said before that we want to be defined by what we are for and not by what we are against. Then we are not attempting to argue the whole paper in a definitive statement at the very beginning, but rather, in a step-by-step process, we come to a more consensual way of living and being. After articulating a viable Outram statement, then we can move to the other sections of the paper, the guidelines for which you already have an attachment, but which I will review in short during the remainder of this podcast. The Videator. This section literally begins with the words, "It seems that." In this section, you give opposing arguments to your initial Outram statement, researching and detailing the truest stakes those persons, communities, and nations have in holding to an opinion that contradicts yours. Search the traditional sources of theological and ethical reflection, scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. Together, these are referred to as the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Traditions may also be scholarly, scientific, ecclesiastical, and so forth. know from where you are deriving your traditions that you are resourcing for your arguments of the Videator. Argue the Videator with integrity as if you were making the argument yourself. The sed contra. This section literally begins with the words, "but on the other hand." Here you will lay out your own reasons for holding the views you have without directly referencing the arguments in the Videator, without the intention of thereby demolishing those opponents uh, uh, or those who are holding opposing views to your own. But here you fully explain your own truest stakes in the initial Outram statement that you made in the first place. Support your belief with the same sources, depth, and rigor with which you argued for the Videator. What should begin to emerge for you as you come to a conclusion of your sed contra arguments is the sense of where common ground may lie between your opposing views to the Videator. The responsio. This section literally begins with the words, "I answer that." Here, revise your initial Outram statement to include thoughtful consideration of the arguments in the Videator. For example, you could say to the initial Outram statement, whether it is the case that God is love, you could say this: "I answer that for those of us who believe that God is, and that God is love, there is a burden of proof to show the meaning of that love through acts of advocacy, benevolence, empowerment, and justice in an unjust world." What I did there was show several objections that might have been raised in the Videator. First, by those who do not believe in God, and second, by those who believe that Scripture demonstrates that God is something other than love. And thirdly, I defended my belief that God is love by defining love as those acts of advocacy, benevolence, empowerment, and justice. And finally, I acknowledge that we live in an unjust world, and that the concept of God and justice are mutually confirming. Finally, the ergo section, the concluding section, literally begins with your choice of the word therefore, or thus, since, so, or hence. And in the ergo section, you draw out at length, your revised initial and viable Outram statement, the implications thereof, what it means, therefore, to say that God is love in an unjust world, what it means for those who hold the moniker Christian to say that love and justice are inviolable, what it means, for example, for our actions, what it means for our policies concerning the church, etc. I hope this is helpful.